The morning I lost my job started like any other ordinary workday. Same lukewarm coffee in my favorite mug. Same boring commute through the gray city streets. Same quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have done nothing wrong. I remember thinking about what I would cook for dinner that night. Maybe a simple pasta dish with garlic and oil, right before everything I thought was stable vanished forever. There was no warning in the thick morning air. No crack in the ground under my feet. Just another Tuesday I fully expected to survive without any drama. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the office, scanned my badge, and said hello to the security guard. Everything felt routine, almost robotic. I settled into my cubicle, opened my laptop, and started checking my morning emails. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, a sound I usually ignored, but that morning it felt strangely loud in the quiet office. I had just started drafting a project update when my manager poked his head over the partition. He asked if I had a quick minute to chat in the small conference room down the hall. His voice was not urgent or tense. It was perfectly polite, almost too pleasant. He even had a small, practiced smile on his face. Something in my stomach tightened anyway, a cold knot forming instantly. I had seen that look before on other people's faces right before bad news was delivered. I stood up, smoothing out my skirt, and followed him. The walk down the hallway felt longer than usual. My heels clicked against the hard floor, echoing in the hallway. I noticed a few coworkers looking up from their desks, then quickly looking away when they saw where I was going. They knew. In an office like this, people always seem to know before the person actually involved does. When we entered the room, a woman from HR was already sitting there. She was smiling, but her eyes were as cold as ice. She offered me a seat like guests do when they are about to tell you something they know you will hate. My manager did not sit down with us. Instead, he leaned against the wall near the door, looking confident and detached. He crossed his arms over his chest, blocking the exit. The air in the room felt stale and recycled, like it had been trapped there for years. The HR woman had a thin blue folder in front of her. She tapped her pen against the table in a rhythmic, annoying click. I sat down, keeping my back straight and my hands folded in my lap. I refused to let them see my fingers trembling. I waited for her to speak, the silence stretching out until it felt heavy enough to crush me. "We think it's best you move on, Natalie," the HR woman said finally. Her voice was smooth and calm, like she was recommending a new brand of tea. She did not say they were concerned about my performance. She did not say there had been a formal complaint filed against me. She just said I should move on. It was the most dismissive phrase I had ever heard in my professional life. It made me feel like an inconvenience, a piece of old furniture they had finally decided to throw away. No accusation I could defend myself against was offered. No mistake I could fix was mentioned. Just a decision that had clearly been made without me ever being in the room to speak for myself. It was the kind of moment that makes your chest tighten because you suddenly realize you were never meant to survive this meeting. The trap had been set long ago. My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 34 years old, and I had spent 5 years at this company. In that single moment, everything I had built there, the years of quiet, hard work, the late-night fixes nobody saw, and my unwavering loyalty collapsed into a single sentence I was not allowed to respond to. I was a senior analyst, the person everyone came to when the data did not make sense. I was the one who stayed until 8 p.m. making sure the quarterly reports were perfect, so the executives looked like geniuses. I had sacrificed weekends and missed family dinners for this place. Now, all of that effort was being reduced to a polite suggestion to disappear. I felt a wave of heat wash over me, followed by a chilling realization. To them, I was never a person. I was just a line on a spreadsheet that they decided to delete. I took a deep breath and asked why this was happening. I wanted a real answer. Instead, they spoke in circles, using corporate nonsense words like alignment and cultural fit. They danced around the truth without ever touching it. My manager finally smiled and said, "Don't take it hard, Natalie. This isn't personal. It's just business." That is exactly how you know it is deeply personal. If it were truly about business, they would have shown me numbers or errors. But they had nothing. They just wanted me gone because I was the only one who saw the cracks in the foundation they were trying to hide. I looked at my manager, Victor Hale, and saw the flicker of relief in his eyes. He thought he was winning. He thought that by removing the witness, He was removing the problem. I realized then that arguing was useless. They had already written the ending of my story. I was forced to pack my desk under the watchful eye of the HR woman. It was humiliating. I put my framed photos, my lucky stapler, and my spare sweater into a cardboard box. People avoided my eyes as I moved through the office. Some suddenly became very busy with their phones, while others turned their chairs toward their monitors. I could feel the whispers starting behind me like a physical weight. Stories were already forming in the break room, rumors about why I was leaving so suddenly. I was not there to correct them or tell my side. I was being escorted out like a criminal after 5 years of flawless service. The box felt heavy in my arms, but my heart felt heavier. As the elevator door slid shut, I saw Victor standing by the glass doors watching me go. He didn't look sorry. He looked like he had just finished a difficult chore. Once I was safely in my car, I did not scream or cry. I just sat there in the quiet parking garage and replayed every second of that meeting. I stared at the concrete wall in front of me until my eyes blurred. Slowly, the initial shock began to fade away, replaced by something much colder and sharper. It was understanding. I began to connect the dots I had ignored for months. The missed meetings, the cold shoulders, and the way Victor always seemed nervous when I looked too closely at his expense reports. I wasn't being fired for being bad at my job. I was being fired because I was too good at it. I was observant, and in Victor's world, being observant was a dangerous trait. I started the engine and drove away, but I wasn't going home to hide. I was going home to remember everything I had seen. My manager, Victor Hale, was a man who had perfected the art of failing upward. He was handsome, charming, and knew exactly how to talk to the leadership team. He used words like innovation and strategy to dazzle the directors, but he couldn't even run a basic pivot table. He delegated every difficult task to me and then took the credit during the big meetings. Somehow, mistakes never seemed to touch him. I finally realized why. It was because I was always there to catch them first. I had been his safety net for 3 years. I fixed his typos, corrected his faulty logic, and quietly cleaned up his messes before anyone else noticed. I did it because I believed in being a team player. I thought that if the team succeeded, I would succeed. I didn't realize I was just building a pedestal for a man who would eventually use it to kick me. The pattern was so clear now that it hurt to think about. Every time Victor messed up a client presentation, I stayed late to fix the slides quietly. Every time I achieved a major breakthrough in our data modeling, he spoke louder in the boardroom, using we, until everyone assumed it was he. I had told myself for years that this was just how teamwork functioned in a corporate environment. I told myself that my hard work would be noticed eventually by the people who mattered. But I was wrong. It wasn't teamwork, it was a parasitic relationship. He was consuming my talent to feed his own ego. I had made myself indispensable to him, which made me a threat. As long as I was there, I was a living reminder that he didn't actually know how to do his job. He needed me gone, so he could finally believe his own lies. The final straw had happened a month ago. A director-level role had opened up, and by every objective metric, that role should have been mine. My performance reviews were perfect, and the clients loved my work. Everyone in my department whispered that I was the obvious choice. But when the announcement came, Victor stood at the front of the room and introduced someone else, a guy he used to play golf with who had half my experience. HR stood in the back and actually applauded. They called it a strategic hire for the future. I stood in the back row, my heart sinking into my shoes, realized then that the game was rigged. Talent didn't matter in this building. Loyalty to Victor did. I looked around the room and saw the fake smiles of my coworkers. They knew it was unfair, but they were too afraid for their own jobs to say a word. After that announcement, the atmosphere shifted. Victor stopped asking me for help with his reports. Instead, he started documenting everything I did. He began asking for written updates every hour. He started watching when I arrived and when I left for lunch. He was looking for a crack, a single mistake he could use to build a case against me. People only do that when they are afraid. He knew I was unhappy, and he knew I knew where all the metaphorical bodies were buried in his department. He was trying to push me out before I could find the courage to go to his boss. The move on meeting wasn't a surprise. It was the final act of a play he had been writing for weeks. He thought that by getting HR on his side, he had secured his future. He didn't realize that some trails can't be covered up just by firing the person following them. 2 weeks before my firing, a major report I had finalized was suddenly wrong. Victor called me into his office and pointed at the screen with a look of fake disappointment. The timestamps on the entries did not match the original logs. Strange errors appeared in the formulas that were definitely not there when I hit save the night before. I knew immediately what had happened. Someone had accessed the file after I left. Victor had CC'd HR on his concerns within minutes of showing me the errors. He was building a paper trail of incompetence. I tried to explain that the file had been tampered with, but he just shook his head and looked at me with pity. Maybe you're just stressed, Natalie. We all make mistakes. It was a setup, plain and simple. He was gaslighting me in broad daylight, and he was using the company's own systems to do it. Let's keep this conversation constructive, the HR woman had said when I tried to show her my own saved copies of the proof. Her tone was soothing and professional, but it was incredibly dismissive. She didn't want to look at my logs. She didn't want to hear about file tampering. She wanted the problem to go away, quietly. That is when I stopped arguing. I saw the wall they had built around themselves. HR wasn't there to protect me, they were there to protect the company from a potential lawsuit. If Victor was their rising star, I was just acceptable collateral damage. I realized that the truth didn't matter in that room. Only the narrative mattered, and Victor had been telling his story much longer than I had been telling mine. I walked out of that HR office and decided I would never waste my breath on them again. They wanted me to move on. Fine. The night I got home after being fired, I opened my personal laptop. I hadn't been careless. For years, I had quietly kept my own records. I didn't do it out of paranoia or a plan for revenge. I kept them because something in that office never felt truly safe. I had a folder full of every original version of the reports I had authored. I had saved emails where Victor had explicitly asked me to adjust numbers to make the department look better. I had screenshots of approval chains and access logs I had taken when the system felt glitchy. I sat in my darkened living room, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and looked at the evidence. It was all there. I wasn't going to blast it on social media or send it to the CEO in a fit of rage. I was going to be patient. I was going to let their own system find it. I spent the next week doing absolutely nothing. I went for long walks in the park. I read books I had ignored for years. I didn't contact any former coworkers. I didn't warn anyone about what Victor was doing. I didn't send any threatening legal letters. I simply let go and waited for the natural consequences of Victor's incompetence to take root. Without me there to catch his mistakes, it was only a matter of time. He had fired his only shield. He thought he was free, but he was actually more exposed than he had ever been. He was now responsible for the very reports he couldn't even explain. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had played my part, worked my heart out, and kept my dignity intact. Now, I just had to watch as the truth prepared to move faster than HR ever expected it could. Exactly 2 weeks after my exit, my phone rang. It was an unknown number from the city. I answered, and a woman introduced herself as a compliance consultant. Her tone was casual and professional. Hi, is this Natalie Brooks? We are doing a routine review of the industrial automation project. Did you previously handle the internal reviews for that? I felt a small spark of electricity in my chest. Yes, I did, I answered honestly. I didn't volunteer extra information. I didn't sound bitter. I just answered her questions with facts. She asked about the data validation process. I told her exactly where the primary logs were stored. She thanked me and said they were having some trouble reconciling the recent numbers submitted by Victor. I told her that didn't surprise me, wished her luck, and hung up the phone. The first pebble had been thrown. The landslide was coming. The audit wasn't actually about me or my firing. That is what made it absolutely perfect. It was a standard compliance check triggered by the very strategic hire Victor had made. The golf buddy he hired had tried to submit a massive expense claim that triggered an automatic red flag in the central system. When the auditors started looking at the expenses, they naturally looked at the project data those expenses were tied to. Victor had underestimated the systems he couldn't charm with a smile and a firm handshake. Algorithms don't care about your MBA confidence or who you know on the board. They only care if the numbers balance. Victor had been playing a game of smoke and mirrors for years, but the mirrors were finally starting to crack. I sat on my balcony and watched the sunset, knowing that the questions were finally being asked by people who couldn't be silenced. A few days later, my former coworkers started texting me. They sounded confused and nervous. "Natalie, some guys in suits are in Victor's office," one wrote. "They are asking everyone about the timestamps on the July report," another said. They were being asked questions that did not align with the narrative Victor had carefully built. They were being shown the very errors Victor had tried to blame on me. Without my expertise to explain away the glitches, Victor was stuttering in meetings. He couldn't explain the logic behind the data because he hadn't written it. He couldn't find the source files because he didn't know where I had archived them. The house of cards was wobbling in the wind. I didn't reply to the texts with gossip. I just told them I was moving on and hoped they were doing well. The silence from my end was deafening. Then HR reached out. The same woman who had smiled while firing me called my personal cell. She wanted to clarify some details about my exit interview. She sounded less like a therapist and more like someone whose own job was suddenly at risk. She hinted that there might have been a miscommunication and asked if I would be willing to come in for a chat. I politely declined. Audits don't need emotions or personal chats. They need facts and hard data. I told her that since I was no longer an employee, I didn't feel it was appropriate to discuss internal matters. I reminded her of her own words. She told me it was best to move on. That is exactly what I was doing. I could hear the panic in her breathing before she hung up. They were realizing that by discarding me, they had lost the only person who could explain the mess. The audit widened significantly. It wasn't just about one report anymore. The consultants started digging into expense approvals, file edits, and access logs from the last 3 years. They discovered that Victor had been approving his own travel for client meetings that never actually took place. They found the file edits he had made at 11 p.m. using his admin override, the ones he used to set me up. The digital trail was impossible to hide once someone knew where to look. Victor's famous confidence evaporated almost overnight. I heard he stopped coming into the office, claiming he was working from home due to stress. But the auditors were already in his laptop. They didn't need him to show up to see what he had done. The truth was moving at the speed of light now, and it was heading straight for him. A week later, Victor Hale resigned to pursue other opportunities. There was no grand farewell email. There was no cake in the break room. There was no celebration of his strategic vision. Just an empty office, and a nameplate that was quietly removed by the janitor after hours. He had tried to play the hero of his own story, but he ended up being the villain of a compliance report. He had thought he was the smartest person in the room, but he had forgotten that systems are built to be consistent. When he left, he didn't even get a severance package. The board had seen enough to realize he was a liability. He disappeared from the professional world, his reputation in ruins. The man who told me it wasn't personal had found out just how personal a total career collapse could feel. He was gone and nobody missed him. The leadership team at the top was forced to change. The directors who had ignored my warnings were quietly retired or reassigned. Policies were rewritten to ensure that alignment and fit were no longer used as excuses to ignore actual performance metrics. Even the HR leadership was quietly replaced by a new team from the corporate headquarters. The entire culture of the office had to be gutted to save the company from a massive lawsuit. No one called me to apologize, of course. They couldn't. Admitting they were wrong would be a legal nightmare for them. But I didn't need an apology. I could see the results from the outside. The company was healthier now, even if I wasn't there to see it in person. I had cleared the air just by leaving the room. The audit had finished the work I had started years ago. Soon after, a recruiter from a top-tier firm called me. She told me she had heard that the truth had surfaced regarding my work at the previous company. She didn't ask for details. The industry is smaller than people think, and news of a major audit travels fast. She offered me a role that was 2 levels higher than my old one. It came with more pay, clear boundaries, and respect written into the contract. When I walked into my new office, I didn't feel the need to hide or be invisible. I was hired for my brain, not my ability to cover for someone else's ego. I had found a place where being observant was considered an asset, not a threat. I sat at my new desk, looked out at a much better view of the city, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment. HR told me to move on, and I did. I didn't destroy anyone with my own hands. I didn't chase revenge or spend my days being bitter. I simply refused to disappear quietly or lie to protect a man who didn't deserve it. I walked away with my records and my dignity, and I let the truth do the rest of the work. Sometimes, you don't have to fight to win. You just have to be the one standing when the smoke finally clears. I learned that my value didn't come from a manager's approval or an HR woman's smile. It came from the quality of my work and the integrity of my actions. I moved on, and eventually the truth caught up much faster than anyone in that old boardroom ever expected. I am Natalie Brooks, and I am finally exactly where I am supposed to be. Would you like me to help you develop a visual timeline or a character map to ensure the consistency of the story's details?